The air was thick with the weight of sorrow, the overcast sky casting a gray shadow over the cemetery. A cold wind whispered through the towering trees, carrying with it the hushed sobs of mourners gathered around the open grave. The priest stood solemnly at the head of the casket, his voice low and steady as he recited the final prayers. The scent of damp earth and wilting flowers filled the air, and every face was turned toward the polished wooden casket that held the body of Eleanor Whitmore. Then, a disturbance. At first, it was nothing more than a flicker of movement between the trees, a shadow shifting just beyond the cemetery's iron gates. A few of the mourners barely noticed, distracted by their own grief. But then a low, almost mournful sound drifted through the air. It was not the sound of a human cry, nor was it the rustling of leaves or the whisper of the wind. It was something deeper, something primal. A murmur rippled through the crowd as they turned toward the sound. A gasp escaped from someone in the front row, their hands tightening around the black fabric of their coat. And then they saw it. A wolf. It emerged from the mist, its massive frame moving with silent grace. Its fur was a striking mix of silver and deep charcoal, its golden eyes sharp and unblinking. The mourners froze, some instinctively stepping back, clutching their loved ones. Wolves didn't come near humans like this, not in the middle of the day, not in a place like this. A young man, perhaps the deceased woman's nephew, quickly reacted. "Get out of here," he shouted, waving his arms in an attempt to scare the beast away. But the wolf did not run. It did not snarl, did not bare its teeth. Instead, it simply stood there, its gaze locked onto the casket, as if nothing else in the world existed. The murmurs grew louder. People exchanged uncertain glances. The priest hesitated, his hands tightening around his book. Then, slowly, deliberately, the wolf moved forward. Its large paws pressed into the damp earth, its head lowered slightly, ears flicking back. And then, from deep within its chest, it let out a sound, a soft, trembling whimper, a sound filled with sorrow. An elderly woman gasped, her voice barely above a whisper. "It knows her." A chill passed through the crowd. The priest, his voice wavering for the first time, tried to continue. "Let us bow our heads and pray for Eleanor's soul." But his words were met with silence because no one was listening anymore. Every eye was locked on the wolf as it approached the casket. A man in the back, uncomfortable with the eerie presence, bent down, grabbed a stick, and hurled it toward the animal. "Go on! Get out of here!" The stick landed inches from the wolf's paws. It flinched, but did not run. Instead, it moved even closer. And then something happened that no one could explain. The wolf sat, right beside the casket. It did not move. It did not leave. It simply sat there, unmoving, its golden eyes filled with something that no one could quite understand. The wind picked up again, sending a shiver through the crowd. Someone whispered, "Why won't it leave?" No one had an answer. Then, the wolf lifted one massive paw and placed it gently against the casket. A heavy silence fell over the cemetery. The priest swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly. The mourners watched in horror, confusion, and awe. Something about this moment was deeply wrong, deeply unnatural. And yet, in the back of the crowd, one man had not spoken, had not moved. The village doctor, standing with his arms crossed, watched the scene unfold with growing unease. His sharp eyes studied the wolf, the way it moved, the way it reacted. And then, as he watched the animal press its paw against the casket, something in his mind clicked. His breath caught in his throat, his pulse quickened. No, this wasn't just grief. This wasn't just a loyal animal mourning the dead. This wolf was trying to tell them something no one was ready to hear. Years before this moment, before the grave, before the sorrow, before the wolf's eerie presence, there was a woman named Eleanor Whitmore. She had lived a quiet life on the outskirts of the village, in a small cottage nestled between the trees. She wasn't a woman of wealth, nor was she one to seek attention. But she was known for her kindness, her patience, and above all, her strange connection to the wild. Eleanor had always been different. While others feared the deep woods that surrounded the village, she embraced them. While others whispered tales of danger lurking among the trees, she walked fearlessly beneath their towering canopies. She had a way with animals, an understanding that went beyond words. Birds would land on her windowsill, foxes would sit at the edge of her garden, and in the dead of winter, when food was scarce, even the most cautious of creatures would inch closer to her door, as if drawn by something unseen. But there was one moment, one encounter, that stood out from all the rest. It was many years ago on the coldest night of the season. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the sharp bite of an incoming storm. Eleanor had been gathering wood when she heard it, a low, pitiful cry echoing from the shadows. It was the kind of sound that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up, a cry of pain, of fear. She followed the sound, lantern in hand, her breath visible in the frigid air. And there, just beyond the tree line, she found it. A wolf pup. It was small, barely old enough to survive on its own, its fur matted with blood. A deep gash ran along its hind leg, a wound that, if left untreated, would surely spell its end. Its golden eyes, wide with fear, locked onto hers. It tried to move, to run, but the pain was too much. It whimpered, its body trembling from cold and exhaustion. Eleanor didn't hesitate. Carefully, slowly, she knelt beside the pup, speaking in a voice barely above a whisper. "It's all right," she murmured. "I won't hurt you." The pup flinched but did not snap at her. It was too weak, too tired. With steady hands, Eleanor wrapped it in the thick shawl draped over her shoulders and carried it home. That night, as the storm raged outside, she sat beside the fireplace, carefully tending to the wound. She spoke softly, her voice soothing, her hands gentle. She fed it, comforted it, and for days she nursed it back to health. Weeks passed. The pup grew stronger, its limp fading, its fear replaced with something else. Trust. It followed Eleanor wherever she went, never straying far from her side. And yet, she knew the truth. The woods were its home. No matter how much it had come to rely on her, it did not belong in a house, nor beside a human. And so, the day came when Eleanor led it back to the forest's edge. She knelt one last time, running her fingers through its thick fur. "Go on," she whispered. "You're free now." For a moment, the pup hesitated. But then, as if understanding, it turned and vanished into the trees. Eleanor never saw it again, or at least that's what she believed. But strange things began to happen after that day. She would wake in the mornings to find paw prints in the snow just beyond her doorstep. Sometimes, on nights when the wind was still, she would hear distant howls, low and familiar. And there were moments, rare but undeniable, when she felt watched, protected, as if something or someone was always near. She never spoke of it to anyone. Not really. The villagers already thought her odd, and she saw no reason to feed their superstitions. But deep in her heart, she knew. The pup had never truly left her. And now, standing at her grave, its golden eyes filled with a grief no human could comprehend, it had returned. Not as a pup, not as a lost creature in need of saving, but as something more, something far more unsettling. The cemetery remained silent, the mourners frozen in place as the wolf's paw rested gently against the casket. The weight of the moment pressed against them, thick and suffocating. No one spoke. No one dared to move. The priest's fingers tightened around his book, his lips slightly parted as if searching for words that would not come. The villagers exchanged uneasy glances, their fear outweighing their grief. And then, without warning, the wolf let out a low, guttural growl. Not one of aggression, but something else. Something deeper. Its ears twitched, its nose pressed briefly against the wood, inhaling as if searching for something unseen. Then, suddenly, it looked up. Its golden eyes locked onto the doctor standing at the back of the crowd. A cold shiver ran down his spine. The doctor had remained quiet through the entire funeral, watching the wolf carefully, piecing together a puzzle no one else had even realized existed. But now, as the beast's gaze bore into him, something in his chest tightened. He had seen strange things in his years of practice. Illnesses that defied explanation, wounds that healed when they shouldn't, patients who claimed to hear voices in the dead of night. But this was different. The wolf's presence wasn't just unnatural, it was intentional. The doctor swallowed hard, stepping forward. His voice, though calm, carried an edge of uncertainty. Something isn't right. The villagers turned to him, their expressions shifting from fear to confusion. The deceased woman's brother furrowed his brow. "What do you mean?" The doctor didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at the wolf, the way it stood protectively over the casket, unmoving. Then, his gaze shifted to the wooden box itself. "Open it," he said. A ripple of shock spread through the mourners. The priest stiffened. The brother's expression darkened. "What? That's insane! We just buried her!" But the doctor didn't back down. His eyes flickered between the wolf and the casket, the pieces falling into place in his mind. "I need to be sure." The wolf let out another sound, a whine, desperate, pleading. It stepped back slightly, giving room, as if it understood, as if it was waiting. The hesitation in the crowd was thick. No one wanted to touch the casket. No one wanted to acknowledge the possibility that the doctor was right. But then, the brother clenched his jaw, his hands shaking slightly as he stepped forward. "If this is some kind of joke..." The doctor shook his head. "It's not." With great reluctance, the villagers helped pry open the lid. The wood creaked, the sound slicing through the heavy silence. The moment the lid was lifted, gasps rang out, followed by a horrified cry. The coffin was empty. A woman fainted. Someone cursed under their breath. The priest made the sign of the cross, stepping back as if the very air around them had turned unholy. The brother stumbled away from the grave, his face drained of color. "No, no, this isn't possible." But the doctor wasn't looking at the casket anymore. He was looking at the wolf, the way it stood there, its golden eyes filled with something almost human, something knowing. And in that moment, everything became terrifyingly clear. Eleanor Whitmore had not been dead when they buried her. The shock of the empty casket sent a wave of terror through the mourners. A woman covered her mouth with trembling hands, her breath ragged. The priest staggered backward, clutching his cross as if it would ward off the horror unfolding before them. The brother stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were seeing. The grave, the coffin, meant to be her final resting place, was nothing but a hollow shell. Eleanor Whitmore was not inside. The doctor's heart pounded. He had suspected something was wrong, but even he had not expected this. He turned sharply to the wolf. It remained still, watching him, waiting. Not as an animal, not as a beast of the wild, but as something that had known the truth all along. The silence was broken by the brother's strangled whisper. This isn't possible." His hands clenched into fists, his body trembling. "I saw her. She was gone." The doctor inhaled sharply. "Did you?" His voice was steady, but his mind was racing. He had examined many bodies before burial. He had seen the unmistakable stillness of death, the fading warmth of the skin. But Eleanor's case had been different. It had all been too quick, too sudden. A quiet death in her sleep, they had said. No signs of suffering, no lingering illness, just gone. But was she? He took a step closer to the casket, running his fingers along the wood. There, at the very edges, he saw them. Faint, barely visible in the dim light, scratch marks, his stomach twisted. Oh no. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The brother's face paled. What? What is it? The doctor's voice came in a hoarse whisper. She woke up. The weight of those words crashed over them like a wave. The mourners recoiled in horror. A woman gasped, gripping the arm of the man beside her for support. She was buried alive. The doctor continued, his voice barely above a breath. His mind raced through the possibilities. Was it an illness? A rare condition that had slowed her heartbeat? Her breathing? A mistake? A fatal mistake? The priest shook his head, eyes darting wildly to the casket, to the ground beneath them. No, he murmured. No, that can't be. But the wolf, who had not moved from its place by the grave, let out a deep, sorrowful whine. Its golden eyes flickered toward the dense woods that loomed beyond the cemetery. The doctor followed its gaze, his pulse quickening. She's out there, he said suddenly. The words sent a new wave of fear through the villagers. The brother shook his head violently. No, that's not possible. If she... His voice broke. Where would she have gone? The wolf turned, stepping back toward the trees, then stopped. It looked at them, at the doctor, at the brother, at all of them, with an expression no animal should have. And then it did something chilling. It howled. A long, haunting sound that carried through the air, sending shivers down every spine. The kind of sound that did not simply belong to a wolf, but to something lost, something searching. And then it ran. Without another glance, the wolf turned and disappeared into the woods, its silver-black fur vanishing between the trees. The doctor didn't hesitate. We have to follow it. The brother hesitated only a moment before nodding, his fear drowned by the desperate need for answers. And so, they ran. Into the woods, into the unknown, into the terrifying truth of what had really happened to Eleanor Whitmore. The forest swallowed them whole, its towering trees stretching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, the ground uneven beneath their hurried steps. The doctor led the way, his heart pounding in his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The brother was close behind, his face pale with fear, but his legs carried him forward without hesitation. Ahead of them, the wolf moved like a ghost, silent, swift, and purposeful. It weaved between the trees, its silver-black fur blending into the darkness, but it never strayed too far. Every few steps it would glance back, as if making sure they were still following. The doctor had no doubt now. The wolf knew something. It had known all along. They pressed deeper into the forest, the voices of the villagers fading behind them. The further they went, the colder it became. The doctor could feel it seeping into his bones, a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. There was something unnatural about this place, something watching. Then, the wolf stopped. It stood at the edge of a small clearing, ears perked, body tense. The doctor and the brother skidded to a halt beside it, their eyes scanning the darkness. At first, they saw nothing, just trees, shadows, and the eerie stillness of the forest. Then they saw it. A shape, small, frail, barely more than a silhouette against the pale glow of the moonlight. A woman. Her back was to them, her thin white dress stained with dirt and torn at the edges. Her dark hair hung in wild tangles over her shoulders, unmoving despite the breeze that rustled the leaves around her. The doctor's breath caught in his throat. "Eleanor?" The woman did not turn. The brother stepped forward, his voice cracking. "Eleanor, is it you?" Still, she remained silent. The wolf let out a low whimper and took a cautious step forward, its golden eyes locked on her. But something about the way it moved had changed. It was no longer just searching. It was afraid. The doctor swallowed hard, his pulse racing. Something was wrong. This wasn't how a lost, frightened woman should react. This wasn't right. He took a slow step forward. "Eleanor, can you hear me?" And then, Without warning, she moved, not turned, not walked, but twitched. A sudden jerking motion, as if she were a puppet on invisible strings. Her head tilted unnaturally to the side, her arms twitching at odd angles. Her breath was loud now, ragged and shallow, as if each inhale was a struggle. Then, slowly, too slowly, she turned. The doctor's stomach dropped. Her face, pale, sunken, her lips cracked and bloodied, was not the face of a woman who had simply wandered into the woods. Her eyes, hollow and distant, were not the eyes of someone who had merely been lost. She had been buried, and yet she was standing before them. The brother let out a strangled gasp, stumbling backward. "No, no, this isn't real." Eleanor's lips parted. A breath, rattling and broken, slipped out. And then, in a voice that did not sound like her own, she whispered, "You left me." The wind howled through the trees, and the wolf let out a deep, guttural growl. Its fur bristled, its body tensed. The doctor's blood ran cold. Eleanor Whitmore was not just alive. She was something else entirely. The brother staggered back, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. His hands trembled at his sides, his body unwilling, unable to accept the thing standing before him. "Eleanor." His voice cracked, barely above a whisper. "No, this isn't possible." The woman, if she was still a woman, stood motionless, her hollow eyes locked onto him. Her body remained stiff, unnatural, as if every bone had forgotten how to move. The doctor could barely breathe. His medical mind scrambled for explanations, clinging desperately to logic, but logic had abandoned them the moment they opened that empty casket. Then, Eleanor moved. A slow, jerky step forward, her bare foot pressing into the cold earth. The wolf let out a deep growl, stepping between her and the men. It lowered its head, its fangs glinting in the moonlight, every muscle in its body tensed. But Eleanor didn't stop. Another step. Her head tilted in that unnatural way, a flicker of something unreadable crossing her decayed features. A whisper escaped her lips, barely audible, but chilling. "You left me?" The brother's face twisted in anguish. "No, we didn't. We thought—" His voice broke, thick with guilt. "We thought you were gone." She twitched at his words, her mouth parting slightly, as if tasting them. Then her lips stretched into something that might have once been a smile, but wasn't. The doctor swallowed hard. "Eleanor," he said cautiously, forcing his voice to remain steady. "You were buried. He hesitated. "We thought you were dead." She blinked. Slow. Unnatural. "I was." The wind howled through the trees, sending a shiver through the branches. The doctor felt his stomach twist. "Then how are you standing here?" Eleanor's cracked lips trembled, as if she wanted to say something, as if there was a battle within her. Then her gaze flickered, not at the doctor, not at her brother, but at the wolf. A silence heavier than any before settled over them. The wolf did not move. It only stared back at her. A slow realization crawled into the doctor's mind. "You weren't alone in that grave," he whispered. Eleanor blinked again, but this time, something in her expression changed. For the briefest moment, it was as if she recognized herself, as if she remembered the woman she had once been. But then, just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. She let out a breath, a low, shuddering sound, like wind escaping a broken door. And then, with a sharp, unnatural jerk, her body convulsed. The brother cried out. The doctor reached for him, dragging him back, as Eleanor's spine arched, her limbs contorting, her mouth falling open in a silent scream. The air around them grew colder. The wolf's growl deepened. And then, Eleanor collapsed. Her body hit the ground in a lifeless heap, her limbs sprawled, her breath still. The forest was silent. Even the wind had ceased. The doctor hesitated, his instincts warring within him. He had to check. He had to be sure. But before he could move, the wolf stepped forward. It did not growl, nor did it bare its fangs. Slowly, cautiously, it pressed its nose to Eleanor's forehead. For a moment, nothing happened, and then it let out the saddest, most haunting sound the doctor had ever heard. A howl, not of warning, not of anger, but of mourning. The doctor exhaled, his own body trembling. It was over, or at least they thought it was, because as the wolf lifted its head, its golden eyes met the doctor's once more, and in them he saw something terrifying. A message, a warning. This was not the end. This was only the beginning.